Well, good afternoon and thank you. Thank you for coming. It's a pleasure to have you here with us. It's also my pleasure to welcome Congressman King to Orange City as well. Just a couple things about Congressman King. He grew up in nearby Storm Lake, attended Denison High School. That's where he met his wife. They have been married for 38 years, or maybe possibly longer than that. But they live in Kyron at least for 38 years. They attend St. Martin's Church in Overvogue, and he and his wife Marilyn have 3 grown sons and 5 grandchildren. After college, Steve King started the King construction firm in 1975, and they have built the firm up from one bulldozer. He brings valuable knowledge because of his work in the construction firm and with agriculture and with other experiences. He brings valuable knowledge to the Congress as an agribusinessman and a small business owner for 28 years. King's oldest son now runs the firm in the construction business. He successfully served the Iowa State Senate for 6 years. In 2002, he was elected to Congress, and he represents Iowa's 5th Congressional District. He serves on the Agricultural Committee, the House Small Business Committee, and the House Judiciary Committee. Indeed, he represents the 5th District well. Just a couple personal comments. A couple years ago, a few of us from Orange City happened to be in Washington, D.C., mainly dealing with energy issues that affect those of us here in Orange City and in Northwest Iowa. We had the privilege of visiting his office. I was pleasantly surprised and impressed at his willingness to spend time with us, because I know that his schedule is very, very busy. But he had that time to spend with us. I was equally impressed with his grasp of the issues that concerned us here in Orange City and here in Northwest Iowa. And I was impressed with his passion to do what is right. I was sent a bio earlier this week. I don't know if it's correct. Probably it is. He is never caught without a copy of the Constitution in his coat pocket. Now, I don't want to put him on the spot, but good for him. But it does reflect his respect for the Constitution of the United States, and I appreciate it. And then I appreciate the fact that he's been a recent visitor to Orange City. He participated in the Tulip Festival parade a couple years ago. He was part of the the ribbon cutting for the Pioneer construction this past fall. And now, once again, he's with us, and we appreciate that representation and the fact that he's willing to come and visit with us. Possibly you noticed on television last evening and again this noon, he has spent yesterday, a good portion of yesterday, traveling the Missouri River, surveying the flood damage, and once again, appreciate the passion that he has and the concern he has for the people who suffered from that flooding situation. So, Congressman King, thank you, and thank you for being with us. Ladies and gentlemen, Congressman King.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for the welcome, Mr. Mayor, here to Orange City. And this is one of many communities in the district that I will tell you just straight out that I can't get back to often enough. There are 286 towns in the 5th Congressional District, and it is the logistics of it make it entirely possible to visit as often as the communities I would think should see their member of Congress. And I appreciate the long-time friendship and working relationship that we've had here. I did miss the Tulip Festival this year, and there was, I'd have to go back and look on my schedule, but whatever it was agonizingly compelling that I had to be someplace else. I hope there is a reserved pair of clampins for me for the upcoming Tulip Festival next year. And maybe I'll learn how to cushion them a little bit like the rest of you do, so I don't end up with a limp at the end of the parade. But it is one of the neatest celebrations in the whole district and across the country, and this county gets it right. And I think you have a lot to show the rest of the state and the rest of the country on how to put the combinations of your communities together. I've often mused about this, that you know, I remember an old computer program where you could sit down and it's called Sim City, if anybody's played that. But to develop, how do you develop a community? And you have to have transportation, police departments, water, sewer, and lights, and all the utilities, and then plug in your retail equipment, the retail stores that are there, your churches, your schools, all the pieces of a community. And I'm wondering, who put that formula together that scores you on your judgment on what the priorities are? And when you come to Orange City to try to write that formula up, so that would be the baseline for Sim City for the rest of the country? I would think so. And I've simplified it down into this way of thinking, that there must be about the perfect balance between banks, churches, and bars. And I think this city has about the perfect balance between those. And we could have maybe a broader discussion on that, but you want to make sure there are people sitting in the pews and there's capital in the bank, and if the bar stools are a little empty, that's all right with me. But I start with that. That's some of the things that I think about. And then I want to let you know that there are a lot of important issues that are going on, and we'll talk about the Washington issues as well as the local issues. I want to speak about the flood a little bit first, that Les brought up in the introduction, and move on and talk about the postal services after that, and then touch bases on a couple of things. But I'm going to surely leave time for questions and comments that are here. So the first thing on the flooding, you know, I have a significant amount of frustration with where we are today with the flooding. I have, if I look back at my experience in history with it, we go back well before the '93 floods and times that I've been involved in flooding activities and traveled to help out in floods and traveled to sometimes just to monitor them. But by 1993, we had 4 construction projects, all large ones I thought, of ours that had been underwater intermittently all spring. And by July 9th of 1993, they were all underwater simultaneously. It was a very, very hard blow to King Construction, and in the end, we came through that. I have told people, never the amount, but I just say we lost 6 figures times X that year. And even though I couldn't help myself, we went down to Keokuk, and I spent a couple of days in the middle of the Mississippi River on a rock pile to help a company survive that otherwise didn't have a way. Government couldn't help them because they were these evil for-profit company. And so we went down with we had left of some of our equipment and our construction forces and helped a company in Keokuk. That's a long story, but it's just one little piece of the long saga of what living through floods does. And so I felt it personally, I felt it from a business perspective. I've been engaged in it in the outreach to help others, and that just sets the stage for the 96 floods that we had. That were also, some of them were higher than the 93 floods, Denison in particular. We engaged in protecting that community and mitigating so that the most water that ever come down the 2 Boyer rivers after we were finished only required tossing of about a dozen sandbags, and otherwise nobody broke a sweat. The work to protect that community, we put it in place and it worked. It got tested by Mother Nature. So then, you know, onward to Katrina. I went down to Katrina right away. I made 4 trips into Katrina. I walked the lower 9th Ward. I painted houses down there. I know what this is like from an economic standpoint and a personal standpoint to suffer through these floods. And your adrenaline goes up while the water's coming up, and when the water crests, you're exhausted and you just kind of drop in a heap, and your volunteers disappear into their regular lives, and then the water goes down either quickly or slowly. In this case, more slowly than any flood this state has ever seen. And your volunteers aren't there, and there's not much anybody can do. You can't even get into your homes. This flood in the Missouri River eclipses any flood that we have seen in the history of time that we've kept records here or had anybody monitoring that. The Pig Sloan program was built and started, the projects actually started in the 40s and up through the 50s and early 60s. 6 dams in the upper Missouri. They were designed to accommodate and protect us from the flooding of the highest runoff we'd ever experienced at the time. That was 1881. And the 1881 water levels were not eclipsed by 1943 flood or the 1952 flood. They built Pig Sloan so that we would not see a flood in the largest experience of runoff that we could record in history. That was 1881. 2011 is more than the 1881 runoff. And so the Corps of Engineers could not have prepared for this much runoff, even though the master manual controls them. And they must follow the master manual. Well, the Corps of Engineers actually puts most of the recommendations into the writing of the master manual. It's around 450 pages, a thick, complicated, convoluted, legalese document that it takes a lot to analyze it all. We've dug down through all of that master manual. I've introduced or drafted, now we'll be introducing when we go back into session, legislation that just goes right to the heart of the Corps of Engineers. And it does this. It directs that they adjust the water levels in the 6 reservoirs upstream so that they can accommodate the runoff from the largest runoff experienced in history to protect and prevent serious flooding downstream. In other words, the 16.3 million acre feet of storage that they have that's just for flooding, and that's of 73.4 million acre feet of water that is the overall storage for all 6 dams. 16.3 million acre feet is what they've always had. In each of the 5 different versions of the master manual, the legislation I'm introducing directs that they increase that. I've looked at 4 different models. The Corps has got to do the calculation. I'm not going to do that in the legislation. But I've looked at 4 different models that they've toyed with, and it might be increasing it by 1.3 million acre feet onto the 16.3 million, on up to about 3.4 million acre feet, depending on how those calculations come out with these are back of the envelope, essentially, calculations. So what it amount to is probably a number less than 20 million acre feet of storage out of the 73.4 million acres of overall storage they have will be reserved for flood protection. And it just makes sense. Big Sloan was built to protect us from the worst flood we'd ever had. Why would we not adjust the water levels to protect us from the worst flood we've had? That's the bottom line. I want to get that passed and passed quickly, and I hope that the representatives in South Dakota, North Dakota, and Montana agree with the representatives in Nebraska, Iowa, and Missouri. If that happens, we've got a chance to move it quickly. That's and so yesterday, and also this level of frustration is that I've twice invited the president to come to western Iowa and look at the Missouri River floods, and written him formal letters, and he declined the first time. I don't know that we got an answer the second time. No, we didn't get an answer the second time, and just ignored the letter. President's been in Iowa twice, and I thought he could at least fly Air Force One over the Missouri River and tip one wing down and look out and see the vast expanse of water. About 150 miles long, and the typical width from downstream from Sioux City starts at about 1.5 miles narrow, gets to 8 miles wide at Blencoe, 11 miles wide north of I-680, and narrows up to 4 or 5 miles wide all the way down to Missouri. And I don't know what it is from there on down. A lot. They still have a lot of water spread out all over everywhere. So because of this lower profile, Midwesterners are not whiners, you might have noticed. Nobody's standing around with signs on street corners saying, "Come help me." They just look to their friends and neighbors and move in with them and do the things they can do to adjust their lives. So it's been very quiet and very low key. But that doesn't mean that they don't have individual disasters of the magnitude of anybody else. It's not, those disasters should not be measured by the decibels of objection that come from the people that are victimized by this flood. Nebraska received the FEMA individual disaster declaration a few days ago. Iowa was rejected. And even though I led on the request for the Iowa congressional delegation, all of them signed on to my request for the individual designation, and the White House turned it down, or the FEMA turned it down. So yesterday, I decided we needed to turn it up, and we had set up a boat tour. FEMA, when they looked at it, they did an aerial tour, and from the air decided that we didn't have a disaster. I can't imagine that. I can see it from the air, but you can't actually measure and quantify it until you're on the ground. The closest you can get to the ground now is in a boat, unless you want to be a diver. And so we set up 4 boats yesterday. We invited all of the television stations in Sioux City and Omaha to come along, and I believe they all did. And we had print interview there, and we did some radio while we're on the boat to try to tell at least the Midwest that we are still underwater here. And this flood it peaked out, the maximum discharge was opened up on June 14th when they kicked it up to 160,000 cubic feet per second discharge out of Gavin's Point. And they've dialed it down just a skosh now to 150,000, but it's still, these water levels have been at this for 2 months, and it is a vast sea, and the farm buildings in particular stick up with just a peak sticking out of the water in a lot of places. And you should think that if you went down and built farm buildings in the bottom 50 years ago or 100 years ago, you build them on the highest piece of ground you had on the whole farm. So a lot of this water that's 8 and 10 feet deep around the farm buildings is 16 or 18 feet deep in some places out in the fields. And it will be there another month at least, maybe 2 months. If we can get it drained down in time to evaluate the damage before freeze up, that's the best we can hope for. So I want to see the individual disaster declaration made. We're asking that FEMA extend this appeal process time to November 15th. That's Governor Branstad's request, and I've supported that with a letter from all of the Iowa congressional delegation again. They've been very good and very supportive on this. I helped them when we had the floods in Cedar Rapids and Iowa City, and they're, from that side of the state, supporting our efforts. So that's what that was about. I think there's a quantifiable formula on qualifying for FEMA disaster, and then there's a political equation to everything that goes on in America, in my opinion. And I tried to lever this up yesterday so people would know what was going on. I put on my waders and went out in the surging water. It is amazing to me. Interstate 680, where when you go south on I-29, if you're going to peel off and go over to North Omaha, say to the airport on Interstate 680, you can't get to that exit because it's surrounded by water. But from there to the Mormon Bridge, that stretch that's, I'm going to say, 4 miles long, maybe 5 miles long, that's water pouring across the interstate. It's been pouring across the interstate for 2 months, and it has eroded the eastbound 2 lanes of that interstate to where the cement slabs are washed off, tipped down, some rolled over and washed away. That grade, as you can tell, is lower by about 3 or 4 feet than the westbound 2 lanes, which are being undercut too in some of that. You hear the roar of the water all the way along for that 4 or 5 miles. You think of a flood as stagnant water full of silt. This is the roar of water of a river that's as wide as 11 miles wide for 2 months at least, and another month after this, pouring down. So we can do something. I want to address it with the legislation. I want to see Iowa receive the individual FEMA disaster declaration, and we want the president to come and take a look at this. We think if he has time to come to Iowa, taking a look over here on the western side. I just said, just tip one wing up and one wing down of Air Force One, and look out over there and just see out the window. If you don't have time to stop, if it's too far for the bus to come over here, just look out the window like George Bush did at Katrina. Doesn't have to be a photo op, just look. And then let us know if you think it's not a disaster, Mr. President. That's my message to him. And then I wanted to touch bases on post offices. These 32 counties in western Iowa are the home of 62 communities that the U.S. Postal Service has decided that they want to close the post offices. Yes, they're small towns. They're small towns that have had postal service, many of them for more than 100 years. And these are services that are important to the communities. And I'm not going to suggest that I think that we can save and protect them all. The inertia of this is so great that it gets to be pretty difficult. But what we're doing is dealing with all 62 communities individually to try to understand their case and be able to help articulate their case and do the best we can for all the communities that we possibly can. And that is, and then there's a level of frustration also. You know, I'm frustrated dealing with the federal government. I can't imagine how it must be for all of you as well. But the Postal Service has kind of carried us along with this, and they had a 138-day process that was going to start that gave you an opportunity for public input. And we found out last night after one of our good team pressed the Postal Service that they had started the clock on July 31st on the 138 days. We find this out on the 18th of October that 19 days of the 138-day clock have already burned up, and then they let us know. So there's been a delay process dealing with USPS, not just in the 63 or 62 communities, but also in the Sioux City Post Office. And I just want to make sure that this message does go back to Sioux City, and I want to make sure that it goes to the Postmaster General. When they decided to, let's say, cancel the postmark for Sioux City and ship even first-class mail up to Sioux Falls for processing, so that when I mail a letter out of my office in Sioux City to my neighbor next door, that letter goes to Sioux Falls for processing, stamped cancellation, and shipped back down to Sioux City and delivered next door to me. That's the level of inefficiency that some of it is being created by what they're doing in the Sioux City Post Office. And we asked for the information, the study, the economic model that they use to do this transformation. And we have, 5 years ago we went through this and succeeded in preserving that service in Sioux City. The efficiencies there are as good as anywhere in the country, and are looking to move it. But we had a meeting that I pushed for a meeting that was more convenient, and it turned out to be over on the Senate side. But Senator Grassley, Senator Harkin, myself were the 3 elected representatives that were invited to be there, plus our staff. And the Postmaster General was, of course, our guest of honor. And in that exchange, I asked him point blank for the study and for the report. And he said, well, he thought they could get it to us. And I said, the unredacted version. I want the unredacted version of your study that concludes that you would move these services from Sioux City up to Sioux Falls. He agreed to provide that, and I said it won't be good enough just to provide it to me, but the community leaders, the city leaders, the chamber and the city leaders have to have access to this information, so they have an opportunity to make a counter proposal that might have more economic efficiencies than the model that you seek to, I guess I might have even said, impose upon us. And the Postmaster General agreed to produce that information to me in a timely fashion, and provide it available to the community leaders, unredacted. For 3 weeks, we've been exchanging emails, making phone calls, pressing them, and for 3 weeks, they have been delaying with another excuse after another excuse. So finally last night, I said, if we don't receive that report by noon today, at 12:01, we're going to release the entire communications email chain of the delay tactics that the Postal Service has used, and I'm going to ask the people in the Sioux City area, call the U.S. Postal Service in Washington, D.C. and demand that they release the study and the report unredacted. That was what I sent to them last night, and it said 12:01 is when we're going to click the mouse. And it's one of the few levers that's really left with the Postal Service. And so right before, I think it was 11:54, we got what? The redacted version of the report. We already had that. And we're being danced around and around as if we're a bunch of fools on the end of a string here. And so I said, click the mouse. Hopefully that shows up in the press in Sioux City. Hopefully people in the area will pick up the phone and call Washington, D.C. And I said, the next thing I do then is I fly back out to Washington, and I'll go sit in his office until we get the report. But every day that the calendar turns over, it's closer and closer to them getting what they plan to do without Iowans and the American people having access to the information that they use. You know, it's one thing to sit in a classified briefing that has to do with national security and know that even then, there's some things they don't tell me, even though I've got classified clearance. But it's another to be talking to the Postal Service and find out there's classified information that we can't look at when they're going to change our lives kind of in perpetuity. So there's a couple of things I vent myself on. Now maybe I can change the tone here a little bit and get over to your questions pretty quickly. I'll just touch bases on a couple things. The debt ceiling debate I thought was focused on the wrong subject matter. There never was going to be a default crisis. It came down to a hard deadline of August 2nd. You heard that over and over again. But the United States is now we're spending about 41 cents out of every dollar is borrowed. And round figures, we have about a little better than $300 billion average cost per month to keep up with the expenses of all of the responsibilities of the federal government. And we have about $200 billion average per month coming in. Well, it actually takes all of $20 billion to service our debt. But that's the first dime on each dollar that comes in. I introduced legislation to make sure our troops were paid first. That takes the first nickel on every dollar. Then the next dime after the first nickel would go to service our debt. You still got 85 cents left out of every dollar to apply to Social Security, Medicare, and other priorities along the way. The United States was never going to default on its debt. And yet we saw debate, and we heard the president say he couldn't guarantee that military pensions would be paid on time. He couldn't guarantee that Social Security would be paid on time. That was the time you should have known it wasn't the truth. He's the only one that actually can guarantee military pensions get paid on time and that Social Security gets paid on time. The president, under current statute, would set those priorities as part of his authority as the Chief Executive Officer of the United States. Instead, it was an effort to scare seniors. and to get the veterans riled up. So I'd like to deal with empirical data. I'd like to deal with the truth. And there was a stampede to resolve this debt ceiling crisis on August 2nd. I could go on with what would sound like a political comment after that, but I wanted to force the issue so that we could have a real debate on the essential components of government. What should government be doing? What are our responsibilities? And how would you prioritize it? Let's just say that, let's say Marvin and Dolores are both going to work every day, and there's 2 checks coming into the house, and one of those checks should stop that amounted to 1/3 of all that was coming in. You would sit down and think, you know, I think we're maybe going to have to sell the yacht. Yeah, I know, it sounds improbable, doesn't it? But, or the camper, or the boat, or the motorhome, or the cabin at the lake. Maybe we're not going to buy that new carpet or that extra TV. You would make priority decisions. And those priority decisions are something that this federal government's not making right now because we kicked the debt ceiling up instead of forcing the debate. That's the sad part of what happened. We didn't force the debate. Now, so this moves the debt ceiling crisis into I call it a crisis, it is now. Now we have a super committee of 12. That means everybody but 12 that's been elected to represent Americans are cut out of this equation, and we think somehow 6 Democrats and 6 Republicans sitting in a closed room somewhere are going to produce a magical formula that solves this problem. I've been through that before, and you know, the vision, the brilliance of our founding fathers was this constitutional republic that we have draws through its representation the wisdom of all the people of America. And part of our job is to draw from that wisdom, sort it, and apply it in Washington, D.C. and other places. It cuts most of that out, and I don't think we come with a very good solution, but it does set up essentially a cage match between Democrats and Republicans and a cage match that puts entitlements up against military spending. I think we can do better than that. I think the committee should have acted with direction on it, but we'll see how that goes. And there's not much we can do about it at this point except all of us weigh in. So that's the debt ceiling piece of this. Is any other topic that needs to come up? I'm good with all of that. I feel like I have been vented a little bit here today, and I feel a little better for y'all letting me say those things that increase my blood pressure. And what I should do then is thank you for your attention at this point and turn this over to questions, comments, or as I often say in lieu of silence, criticism. Start with criticism if you like, I guess. Thanks for hosting this, by the way, Jim. I appreciate it, and thank the mayor for his introduction and the hospitality here in Orange City. What's on your mind?
I was shocked to get a thing on my phone from Pat Boone. And he said, sounded like him, and he said, Stephen King has not passed legislation that will harm Medicare. You know, he went on to really protect you on that. And I was kind of surprised. Is the slandering machine already going against you?
Yes. I don't get time to watch television, but they tell me they're running television ads against me, radio ads against me, and robocalls against me. And that's, you know, as early as a year and a half out from the election. It's a little distracting to try to do your job if you have to keep correcting the record while you're busy trying to move the country forward, looking backwards to correct the record. I wasn't aware that Pat Boone was on the phone, and I find him to be a fine Christian man and an individual whose message is generally fairly clear. And I'm not yet, you know, of knowledge of what he's saying, but with regard to Medicare, here are the facts on Medicare. And that's this, that Obamacare cut Medicare $532 billion. Anyone that voted for Obamacare, advocated for Obamacare, advocated for cutting Medicare $532 billion. I believe that there was a marginal calculation in the resources that would go into Medicare under Paul Ryan's budget. That might be what the other side is alleging if they say that, you know, they make an allegation about whether or not I'm supporting seniors. I represent, I think, the most senior congressional district in America. Iowans have the highest percentage of our population over the age of 85. And in this 5th district, these 32 counties in western Iowa, we have 10 of the 12 most senior counties in the state. So I would argue that we're the most senior, which means we live a healthy lifestyle, we get our exercise and have a good diet, and we have a reason to be interested in what goes on in life. But the Ryan budget was a promise from Republicans to Republicans. And it wasn't the best choice that we had on the floor. I voted for the Republican Study Committee's budget too, which was stronger. The Ryan budget, even though he took a lot of flack and still takes a lot of flack over it, doesn't balance for 26 years. And I have a lot of trouble with that. Marilyn and I have 3 sons, as Les said, in their early 30s, and one of them's 35 now, so mid-30s. And they have worked probably for a year or 2 when we had a balanced budget. For the most part, the last 10 years, we haven't had one. And to say to my sons that I serve in Congress trying to fix this problem, and they're going to be knocking on the door of Medicare or Social Security before they see the federal government balance the budget is just completely an untenable equation for me. I want it balanced much sooner than that. And so the rest of this, there will be a lot of things that will be said over the next 15 months or so. I will tell you that there's Soros money lined up against me, Nancy Pelosi money, Emily's List money, Planned Parenthood money. That's just some of the things that are lined up against me now. And I will be learning things about me that I do not yet know by watching commercials on television. And you may have already learned some of those things that I do not yet know.
Maybe you shouldn't watch television.
It helps when I don't. And strategically, what's the antidote to misinformation? Ask questions like you did, get the facts, and if we know each other, these elections aren't really won by television commercials. They start the conversation. But if we know each other, there's somebody sitting at the table that can provide the rebuttal. And then say, I know better, I talked to him, this I know for a fact. And so those kind of discussions and dialogue don't go very far if there's always somebody there that knows the truth, which is the case with Representative Luans in every case, and Representative Soderberg, whom I should have acknowledged here at the opening. I appreciate gentlemen serving Iowa the way you do, keeping your budget under control.
That's right.
Yes, sir.
Sir, I have a question relative to our effort in Afghanistan. If I have my figures correct, and I believe that I do, 80% of the Afghans are illiterate, meaning they can't read and write. So how do we do nation building when we can't nation building with those folks when they're virtually illiterate and continue to spend approximately $2 billion a week in Afghanistan?
It's a very tough proposition there, and I have concerns about it in a lot of different ways. I thought when we saw the surge for Afghanistan ordered by the president, first of all, General McChrystal asked for, I'm going to go back by my recollection, it was at least 75,000 troops that could turn this into high odds of success. Might have been 80. I'm going to go 80 because as I remember, it was in increments of 20,000. 80,000 troops would be very likely to succeed in the prescribed amount of time, whether that was I don't remember the exact amount of time now. Then another alternative was 60,000 with less odds of success. 40,000 was the minimum number of troops that could get the job done. And after a 3 or 4 month wait, we got a decision that became 35,000 troops. Even then, I thought, and sitting in briefings and talking with people that I've now built relationships with over a number of years, I believed we could pull off the security detail in Afghanistan. But it looked to me like if the nation building component of that was out of the State Department, Hillary Clinton's job was a lot tougher than say, the military's was. To set up government institutions in places where they'd never been before, to take it out into the hinterlands of Afghanistan, especially do so in a government that's centrally located out of Kabul, that was power-centric under President Karzai, who appoints all the governors, and through appointing the governors controls all of the, nearly all of the seats, all the way up and down through local government. I think that we put together a formula that it's very difficult to succeed. I went over there into that part of the world, and because the State Department wouldn't support the trip, we had to go into another country to meet with the Northern Alliance I will call them the warlords up there, but these are the warriors that defeated the Russians. These are actually the men that led the cavalry charge on, I'll call it ponyback, with an AK-47 in their hand to charge the Russian tanks. And they're, the Northern Alliance is who defeated the Russians. And when September 11th hit, now soon, exactly 10 years ago, the Northern Alliance was there ready to go. We injected in a small number of special operations forces and air cover and helped them, and they provided the boots on the ground for the most part to drive the Taliban out of Afghanistan. Then they looked at Americans and decided that now we were there, we were going to stay there, that we wouldn't allow a power vacuum like happened in the aftermath of the Russians being driven out of Afghanistan when the Taliban came in. And so they accepted the Constitution that we offered. That Constitution sets up a 25% quota for women in the elected offices in Afghanistan. Whatever that goal means, we don't have that in the United States. And they imposed that in Iraq and the State Department, and they imposed it in Afghanistan. The result of it is that you can't offer a constitutional government like the United States has, because the quota requires that you have a slate of candidates, 25% of which are female, in a patriarchal society in the way Afghanistan is. So that set up the parliamentary form of government, but they set it up as Karzai-centric, as I said. And that central power base, Karzai then built a coalition with, I believe the number is 42% of Afghanistan or Pashtun tribe. And so a small addition of a couple other tribes gets him his coalition. Meanwhile, the rest of the tribes, and it's very much tribal, are cut out of the decision-making process. And they gave up, the Northern Alliance gave up their heavy weapons. So they're frustrated without representation, without being able to defend themselves, and we're in a scenario where Karzai and our White House now are negotiating with the Taliban on how they can share some power and find a way to walk out of Afghanistan. I have an idea for a solution. I'm not in a position to bring that solution. It's going to take a president and a State Department to do so. But I've been working with John Bolton and others on this to offer a new constitution for Afghanistan that allows for regional representation, so the Northern Alliance in particular can have a voice in government. I think if we could do that and let the tribal nature of Afghanistan get back into its balance of power, I think the country could come together without the Taliban being a strong force. It's very complicated and it's very frustrating. Maybe I should hear your follow-up response to what you've just heard me say, sir.
Well, you've given me one hell of a long answer.
Yeah. I didn't have a short one, right?
But the fact of the matter is, I guess, my point is this: we still have 80% of the population being illiterate. If the military would choose to move out of Afghanistan, and from what you just told me, the State Department would more than likely be responsible for taking over that position and creating a unified government and whatever. Has our State Department got the capability to do that?
I haven't been there in pretty close to a year, and I don't know if I can say yes to that. I don't know that I can say definitively no, but it seemed to me like it was a very difficult task from the beginning. And I just apologize for the long answer. I remember that it was Mark Twain that wrote that. He apologized for the length of the letter that he'd written. He didn't have time to write a short one.
Oh.
Meaning you have to think about the short answer. But it's a very difficult.
Well, I mean, to me, it's a cost versus reward benefit. And, you know, if we're spending $2 billion a week and we never get the people to be 50% literate, what have we gained?
I don't know what kind of progress we're making for literacy there. The difference, a lot of differences in Afghanistan and Iraq, but one of the differences is that Iraq has a higher level of literacy, at least among the men. But I was there in the fall of 2003, and I saw girls going to school for the first time. They got to go to school on Wednesdays at the first part of that. It is a long, hard slog all the way to bring them into the modern world. And you know, maybe in our lifetime, the culture never supports the education necessary. But I'm to this point where I want to see a balanced function of government, and the literacy is a component of that. It's I need to talk to more smart people about this.
I don't want you to get me wrong. I'm a retired military officer with 30 years of service, Vietnam era guy, and I just don't see any progress being made. We'll leave it at that. And I think that's something that you and Congress need to address with the military as well.
I just add to that now, and I know the component about you now, and I appreciate it, especially. I made it a point to get to every classified briefing during the Bush years. I got tactical information, I got classified information. And there was a transition that took place in the last 2.5 years or so, and the classified briefings became political rather than tactical. And it's awfully hard to find out anything unless I go into that part of the world and sit down and talk to Iowans who will, off the record, talk to me. And it's been over a year since I've done that. I need to go back. Thank you.
What would be the consequences of pulling out, Congressman?
Taliban takes over, Al-Qaeda comes back in, and we end up where we were 15 years later, or 20. That's the
The
downside.
Afghans would allow, it would happen.
If they're going to power share with the Taliban, how can we forget they're our enemy? They were blowing up the Buddhist monuments, and they're the ones that drove the life expectancy of women down below that of men. They were the only country in the world that was that bad. I sure don't want to see the Taliban come back in. And I can tell you the Northern Alliance defeated the Russians and the Taliban, and they don't understand why we're negotiating with the Taliban. I think if we could empower them, they would provide the counterforce, and maybe that's part of the solution. And that discussion with John Bolton, I don't want to go very far with that. I called him from India not that long ago, and we started this process, and we're working on it, but I can't crack through. Foreign policy is set by the President of the United States, and that's constitutional, and I respect that. So I can suggest, but I don't want to try to take any of that over. I remember Nancy Pelosi going to Syria, and Assad's still there, and I think that helped empower him. So I'm pushing information back through back channel and trying to get it to come up through some of the good thinkers that we have. That's about what my limitations are, except for going back and getting more current.
Well, you know, the fact of the matter is, I'm all for keeping the Taliban out of the United States, don't get me wrong. But you know, the Russians went in there, they got their butt kicked and eventually left. And I'm not saying that we're having our butt kicked, but it's costing us $2 billion a week. You know, if you want to get part of the budget under control, that might be a place to look.
I will look at that and take the comments you made under advisement here.
Oh, that's fine.
I think I need to drill in a little more on what's going on in Afghanistan. I hope I can get back there soon. Each time, what kept me out of there this year, and I haven't been there in all of this fiscal or this calendar year, is that we have 87 new freshmen, and I don't think any of them had been over there before unless they were deployed there. And so each time there was a congressional delegation going over, I stepped back in deference to allow freshmen to go in because they had not been there to experience, and I thought that was more important. But thank you. I see Dwayne. Gentlemen.
Thank you. Appreciate your representing our area, and I thank you from the bottom of my heart because you stand for the principles we stand for here. I did see one small little item about there must be some consideration or thinking about sending our troops into Mexico to take care of the drug cartels. I don't believe that's going to be a good situation, but is in that whole discussion, is there any idea of looking at the border and changing our issue with posse comitatus, because military cannot defend within our own borders or, you know, take up arms against the people within the U.S. But if there are these terrorists coming along with drug cartels, has that been discussed in keeping our borders secure in that manner until we get a wall built or a fence or whatever? But I don't believe this idea if we're going to go in and straighten out the drug problem with physical force in Mexico is a good idea.
I'm very uneasy about that idea, and I don't expect this president will do that, but he's surprised me before. We had some serious discussion about amending the posse comitatus statute back in 2006 and 7. But I don't remember it coming up as an item to seriously discuss in the last 2.5 or 3 years. And it's something that the people listening to this or my staff is taking a note on for us to drill back in and find out what's going on. And I said, Cassie's takes care of the immigration in the back. So she's got that down. We'll drill in and see what's going on with that. There's been a lot of this has been on hold here over the Obama presidency, partly because I didn't want to see things come through on immigration when Nancy Pelosi was the speaker and they had the ability to pass most anything they wanted to pass. I thought we'd end up with a bad result. And now we have a majority in the House and we can be a little more bold and we can open up these discussions. I think that's a good point. There have been something like 40,000 people killed in the Mexican drug wars over the last just few years, 3 or 4 years or so, wherever they drew that line. That number's been going up to 38,000 and now over 40,000. It is the threat of violence spilling over on us from northern Mexico. It already has spilled over. It's spilled over, but not to anywhere near the extent they have it down there. I've had 40,000 people killed in the drug wars, and we should keep in mind also that on our side of this, there's a part of this equation that we have not addressed adequately, and it's partly because we apparently accepted a certain threshold of illegal drug abuse in the country, and because there is a high demand for illegal drugs in the United States, that's what draws the drugs through from Mexico. 90% of the illegal drugs consumed in America come from or through Mexico. And if we could shut down that demand, it would do a lot to solve the problem on the border. But we're accepting the use and the abuse of drugs as part of what our society is. And the Mexicans are fighting it, and a lot of them are getting killed. So there's two parts of it. I want to secure the border, I want to build a fence, and I'm just seeing they're building the part of the fence that they want, and they're leaving the rest go. It got undermined in a number of ways, and part of it was a Republican from the Senate that introduced some language a few years ago that shut down some of the fence construction. I want to build it. I don't say that we have to build 2,000 miles. I think we just start building it where the highest traffic is and build it till they stop going around the end. And we'd only build the fence that was necessary, and I don't have to make the argument that we build all 2,000 miles right away. Another thing that happened was yesterday. I was home for a little while, and I got a phone call from Tom Tancredo, and he was watching what was happening in the news, and it was a memo that came out in June that has just hit the news yesterday that Janet Napolitano, the Secretary of Homeland Security, has announced that they're no longer going to deport people that they view are not a threat to the United States, not serious criminals. And when you hear that serious word before criminals, it's a qualifier, because those who come across the border illegally are criminals. It is a crime to enter the United States illegally. About 60% of those in the country illegally did that. About 40% overstayed their visas. So they're no longer going to deport serious criminals, which means illegal entry into the United States is not considered a serious crime by the Department of Homeland Security. If you're young, if you're going to school, if you have family members here, apparently if you're contributing to the economy, in other words, if it's inconvenient to be deported and we're not afraid of you, then we're not going to deport you. That's the policy of Homeland Security. I think it's wrong. I think we need to enforce the law. And I don't think it's discretionary on the part of Homeland Security, Justice, or anybody else. And this administration has made the argument that Arizona's immigration law is unconstitutional because Congress, this is not true, but it's what is in the argument, Congress has entrusted the executive branch with establishing and maintaining a, quote, careful balance, close quote, between the various and competing immigration laws, and because the State Department, the Department of Justice, and Homeland Security, and I suppose the Ag Department for that matter, all have interests in illegal immigration in one way or another, and they think they should be able to balance that. Congress never directed any executive branch to find a balance. We passed a law. It's the executive branch's solemn oath to execute it and uphold it. That's our Constitution. That's the oath they take. And so I'm watching this. What we have now is administrative amnesty that's been announced by the Department of Homeland Security and Janet Napolitano. And so that's very disappointing to me, and it's something we're going to have to turn a lot of attention to.
Yes, Congressman, you mentioned earlier about the postal offices being closed in smaller communities and so on. Wouldn't it make a lot of sense in smaller markets it costs us well over 6 figures to hire a person with building and utilities. wouldn't it make a lot more sense to contract out with an existing business, whether it's a convenience store or grocery store, that could bid to provide some of those same services in a small community, rather than trying to just shut down completely, and it would save hundreds of millions of dollars to still provide those services to those small markets?
Mark, I think so. And I'm starting to hear those kind of proposals come forward. And that's part of the value of having legitimate public discussion and hearings. And if the Postal Service wants to keep a complete monopoly on the mail, then they will shut out those kind of solutions, and that means people will have to drive a long ways or wait a long time to get their mail. I think those are very legitimate solutions to contract that out. And you think about where the Postal Service got started, and I always think of the Pony Express of what got the mail out to the corners. We'll find a way to get the mail there, but that's a good economic way to do that. And if the community is going to lose its postmaster and lose the post office, let's find a way that we have that accessibility. That makes perfect sense, and hopefully that dialogue will be injected into the ears of the Postal Service as we go forward on our 138 days of public hearings. And at this point, I want to also thank my staff for being out to most of these meetings. I don't know if we missed any, but it's I don't know anybody that's been as aggressive on that, and to be out there to inject some of these ideas in and to ask questions. That's an idea I hope you're there to inject in. Person who generates it, presuming it is always the best one to make the argument. You become the chairman of your committee when you do that, you see.
I've got enough chairmanships involved. So.
But I like it. That's an idea that doesn't diminish the service, and it saves a lot of money. I like it. Anything else? Yes, Chuck.
One thing that it appears that is going on, stepping back in time a couple of years, there was legislation, the cap and trade legislation, which did pass the House at the time, did not pass the Senate, so it was not signed into law. Now it appears that the same objectives are going through EPA through the regulatory process. I know just a few weeks ago there was a utility out in the eastern United States that's going to have to shut 3 to 5 plants, electric generating plants down. It's going to lose several thousand jobs. They're going to have to go in the open market, which is going to increase their cost, which the consumers have to pay